Good afternoon, everyone. This session is Net Zero Nutrients. We want to thank everyone who couldn't get into Deepak Chopra for coming to our session. That's great.
And you can't leave now.
You can't. We're locking the doors. So we're excited to tell you about some things, and then we're excited to try and do some work with you. The subtitle of the talk is Crowdsourcing the Next Metric, and we're excited to try and learn from the wisdom of the crowd today. So again, thanks for coming. I want to introduce the panel. Pete Munoz, directly to my left, is a senior engineer at Biohabitats. He runs the Portland office for Biohabitats. He's a professional engineer, does everything wastewater. And Pete and I have worked together on biological wastewater treatment systems. Pete having the distinction of actually knowing something about it, which is nice. To Pete's left is Pat Lando. Pat is a landscape architect and likes to say that he's a green infrastructure consultant as well. Pat is in my hometown of Portland. He is kind of a perennial in the green building industry there. He's done really groundbreaking work in green roofs and green walls, water harvesting, et cetera, et cetera. And I heard him talk many times before I got into this business myself. All the way down is Dr. Harold Leverance. He's a researcher at UC Davis, civil engineer, and a consultant in all things having to do with water and wastewater. To give you an idea of what Harold is like, when he arrived in New Orleans, he brought us, each of us on the panel, a little vial of fertilizer that he made at home from his own urine.
Welcome gifts.
And maybe it'll tell you a little bit about our panel that we were all really thrilled to get this.
Yes. We all cheered.
My name is Craig Briscoe. I am about 15 years into a career in architecture, mostly around green building, technical design, and sort of research-based projects. I am happy to say that I'm on sabbatical right now. And I hope some of you can join me on sabbatical someday. It's great to have some time to sort of think and do some writing and some research and think about the next phase of my career. Let's jump right in. We have some learning objectives. I won't bother you by reading these to you. We're required to have this slide in our deck. Moving along. Talk about what we're going to do. We'll do some introductions. We'll talk a little bit about what we're here for and why we're doing this. And then we're going to have about 45 minutes of what we hope is really dynamic education from everybody on the panel to get you sort of up to speed on nutrients and nutrient cycling. And then we get to the crowdsourcing. Below the orange line on the agenda here is the active part of the session. We'll pose a couple design problems to you, and we're really, really interested to see how everybody, all the smart people in the room, work through these problems that we're trying to solve ourselves, just in how we think about this topic, how we think about nutrient cycling in the built environment. We have some fancy technology in the room today, so we'll be doing electronic polling. The way this works is you can text an answer to a question that we ask, and it's a little bit confusing. I've done it backwards several times, so looking at the instructions here, you can see that the number 22333, that's the number.
And this is your time to practice, so everyone, okay to get out your phones. That
is the number that you text to. And the first number that's shown there on the poll, 1156252, yes, got that right, is the code. So that's the poll that you're responding to. So start out your text with that number. Put that in the text of your text, if you will. And the first question we're asking you is already up on the screen. What's your profession? We're interested, as we go through the sort of introductions here, in hearing who's in the room with us. So pull out your phones if you feel like participating.
Please do. So one more time.
One more time. Text your message to the number 22333. And in the body of your text, put in the poll code, which is 1156252.
And then throughout the talk, the number 22333 will be the same number you dial to. We'll just change that first number in your body text.
Excellent.
Good.
One final note about the polling. Any inappropriate texting will result from you being ejected from the room. Jason Twill is here. Listen closely. So we are here to talk about nutrient cycling. We're here to talk about making waste equal food. Waste equals food in nature. There are a lot of deep thinkers whose work I respect who go towards this idea. It's a really traditional idea, right? In traditional societies, human waste goes directly back to agriculture in a virtuous cycle. When I ran across this quote, this is a Wendell Berry quote in a book by Sim Vanderen, and when those two guys get together and share an idea, I know there's something serious going on, so this was a real inspiration for me. Here's a photograph of a traditional nutrient cycling system, traditional food system. So this is Richmond, Virginia, about 1908. These are the vegetable men. They are selling produce, and you can see that their transportation system is directly integrated with the production of food. So the horse manure goes back to the fields. It's saved, very valuable at this time, goes back to the fields and provides the nutrients for the next cycle of vegetables. In the same way, the vegetable men's own production would go back to the fields. And so night soil was an important source of fertilizer in a system like this. Today, our system is a little bit different. It's a little more like chemical warfare, to tell you the truth, the way we approach nutrients. There are three primary nutrients. You've probably seen these on bags of lawn fertilizer, et cetera. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. Potassium is or potash is a very abundant mineral. It is mined, and so there's some impact, but it's well distributed around the world. It's not one that we worry about being limited. Nitrogen is incredibly abundant, and there's, as you can see from this formula, a relatively simple way to secure it from the environment, from the air we breathe. It's energy intensive, as Pete will talk about, and so we need to watch the use of that. Phosphorus is potentially really a puzzle. Phosphorus is mined, comes from rock phosphate, and is processed with acid. And there's a fairly abundant supply, but it's a little isolated around the world. We'll get into that in a second as well. We end up with a lot of these nutrients out of place in the environment. So here's an aerial satellite photograph of the coast off of New Orleans. Mississippi River comes down. As it comes, it's got nutrients that are rejected into it from wastewater treatment plants. It has nutrients that are washed off of farm fields. They end up in the coastal waters. They cause algae blooms. The algae dies, absorbs oxygen, and we have massive fish kills. So there's a big dead zone off the coast of New Orleans. That's the direct result of nutrients out of place. And so we're asking the question, is there a way that we can take this current paradigm, the NPK, and start to think about a paradigm where we cycle nutrients constantly? And how can we describe that? Net Zero Nutrients is sort of the tagline that we have for this talk. We're not sure that it's the right metric, and that's what we want to work on today with you. I'm going to jump quickly into issues and solutions. So each of us has about 8 minutes and no more of presentation for you, just to try and get lay a ground base of knowledge so that we can work through the exercise later on. Let's first talk about who's here. A number of architects.
Engineers.
Construction manager.
Saw a lot of nerds being listed in there earlier. Engineers.
Engineered. You're all
Designers,
very welcome.
Regulators.
Glad to see a student from UC Davis, so that's exciting.
Excellent. So as we go through this next, these 4 8-minute presentations, we have another question for you. Let us know if there's something that surprises you or puzzles you, something that you need clarification on, or et cetera, and we'll try and get to that at the end after we've all sort of gone through our presentations.
Yeah, and one reason we're asking this question throughout is we're going to go fast. So we call this session speed geeking. So you'll be geeked speedily.
Here we go. I'm going to talk about phosphorus. So as I said, it's one of the key ingredients. Phosphorus is important in plant growth, for fruiting in particular. It's important for cell development in humans, bone development. We are all kind of repositories of phosphorus. We collect it over our lives. When we die, it goes with our bones to the graveyard. And so in very old graveyards, you will find a lot of nettle growing, as in the bottom left photograph. Nettle is an indicator species for phosphorus. So if you go to an old churchyard, you can pick nettles. They're edible. So you can participate in the cycle of life. Phosphorus, as it's used in industrial agriculture, is a crystalline product. You can see it on a spoon there. It is this photograph is intended to make it look like a spoonful of heroin, and I want you to really think of this as an addiction for our society. Here's a graph of that addiction. This is global phosphorus fertilizer use over time, and it's an interesting sort of group of sources. So manure is at the bottom there, a relatively constant source, although it hasn't gone up as much as you would think with population. Human excreta is very constant over time. We can probably say that when population really started to spike, we invented the flush toilet, or developed the flush toilet. And so that resource started to get flushed away rather than collected and dealt with in some other way. And then phosphorus rock. Use of phosphorus rock starts to spike in World War II, really spikes during the Green Revolution, and continues to go up today. This is where it comes from. It comes from huge open pit mines. To give you an idea of the scale, that's a person.
Yikes.
From these mines, it goes to processing plants, and it's processed with, as I said, with heavy acids. That there are resulting tailings that are heavy metals. It's a pretty nasty process. Phosphate reserves are geostrategically isolated around the globe as well, and so you can see there's none in Europe. There's a little bit in China, a little bit in the U.S. And then 74% of it is in Morocco, and next door to Morocco in Western Sahara. And it's maybe no coincidence that Morocco invaded Western Sahara several years ago, and there's a border dispute, but they took over an awful lot of really valuable mineral reserves when they did that. So it's people are watching the supply of phosphate around the world, and they're watching it strategically. Let's talk a little bit about personal production. This is a friend of ours. I think we all saw Rick Fedrizzi speak last night. Over the course of a year, Rick might make about 50 liters of feces. That's dry weight, so it would be more than that. About 500 liters of urine. And I'm sure he's got low-flow toilets, but even so, it would take 8,843 liters of water to flush all that down the drain.
Much higher that extends beyond the screen.
Way beyond. And Rick, as with all of us, could fertilize about an intensive vegetable garden of about 50 feet by 50 feet. And, by weight, his urine would produce about 0.4 kilograms of pure phosphorus, and his feces about 2 kilograms of pure phosphorus. Hand it over to Pete.
Our next speed geeking session, we'll switch to one of the other two main nutrients, nitrogen. So Rick would also produce about 4.5 kilograms of nitrogen per year between feces and urine. And why is nitrogen important? We said earlier that it's abundant, right? It's 78% of our atmosphere. It's everywhere. It's an odorless, colorless, tasteless element, and it's in everything, right? It's in all living things. It's in our atmosphere. It's used for fertilizer. It's used to make glue. It's used to make explosives and Kevlar. Those two go hand in hand, I guess, a little bit. 98% of all pharmaceuticals have nitrogen in them, and it's used to do lots of cool stuff, right? It's used in food preserving. It's used to remove warts. It's used by plants to grow. it's this amazing, amazing element. The problem is it can start to concentrate in areas where we don't want it. But in a perfect world, right, the nitrogen cycle, and this is our token slide to the French heritage of New Orleans. But in a perfect world, right, things grow, nitrogen is in plants, is in animals. Animals are excreting nutrients, it's getting into the soil. It goes through all sorts of exciting transformations, which we're not going to get into in this speaking session, but we can talk about nitrogen transformation afterward. It gets released through denitrification into the atmosphere. It gets fixed by nitrogen-fixing plants back into the soil. It's this perfect symbiotic, cycle of life, right? That's not all true. What actually happens is we strip it out of the air, and it starts to concentrate in our waterways. It does that through the production of fertilizer from the air, over-application into our ag fields, and runoff into our surface waterways. It does that through our consumption of food and excreting it and putting it into our wastewater systems, which then partially treats it and gets it into our waterways. So there's all this concentration of nitrogen out of the air, being used, and then into our waterways where it starts to, as Craig mentioned earlier, grow algae and produce not so great aquatic conditions for life. And this is not unique to New Orleans, as the slide that we showed earlier, but it's all over the world, right? It's in it's on every continent. It's in third world, second, first world countries. It's everywhere.
The Arctic.
The Arctic. So backing up a little bit about nitrogen and taking that out of the air and converting that into fertilizer. This is an amazing process called the Haber-Bosch process by two Nobel Prize winning scientists, German scientists. And they developed this process in 1910, and it essentially takes a little bit of nitrogen, a little bit of hydrogen, and a ton of energy, and presto changeo, you basically get fertilizer out with a little bit of water in the form of steam and CO2. Really amazing process, without a lot of input and without a lot of pollution. And what that looks like, this is a similar graph to what Craig showed earlier, but this is for nitrogen production. And what the process that was started in 1910, you can see a huge spike of nitrogen production. It allowed our population to boom, right? We mentioned World War II. It's also used in explosives, so there was definitely an uptick there. It helped the Green Revolution in the 50s. And so it's this enormous conversion over the last 100 years of taking nitrogen out of our atmosphere and getting into our surface waters through ag production. So we're gonna snapshot here to the beginning of the last century. This is when we started thinking more interestingly about wastewater treatment, and nutrients is a big part of that.
Great, thanks, Pete. So I'm going to pick it up here and introduce kind of the topic of wastewater treatment. And I just wanted to point out this graphic that's on the screen. That's up here. This is an image from London. This is the Thames River. And basically what was happening at that time, around the turn of the century, like the late 1800s, is that there was so much pollution, so much human waste and trash and all kinds of solid waste going into the river that the odor was overpowering, and people didn't know how to manage that issue. So we've come a long way. If you look at how our rivers look now, they look a little better than this. But at one point in our history, there was rivers that caught on fire because of industrial pollution that was being discharged. And that was the impetus behind a lot of the regulations that we have now protecting water quality in rivers. So you can see that this kind of transition and development of wastewater treatment, wastewater collection and treatment happened around 1900 is when we started putting in infrastructure for wastewater collection and treatment. So in this part of the talk, what I wanted to do is give you kind of a brief introduction to kind of the history of wastewater treatment and how we got here, the kind of the momentum behind the infrastructure systems that we have, and also talk about the unintended consequences of how we developed our wastewater systems and kind of the systems that we have now and some of the issues that have come up since then. So looking at this photo, this is a farm field, and this is called a sewage farm. So back early on, we knew that we had issues if you dump sewage into rivers because of the odor issues and fish kills and eutrophication. It even made the rivers so you couldn't navigate with strip, like commerce, so it inhibited commerce, and that was a big problem. And we also knew that if you filtered water, wastewater through the soil, that's how we get some of the best water quality. The best treatment is filtering it through soil. And so early on, we came up with systems like this, like the sewage farm concept, where we were irrigating farm fields with sewage from cities. So we had cities, and we took the wastewater, collected it, irrigated these farm fields, and that would work great for a while. But the issues that came up, kind of some technical problems, is that you don't need water all the time, year-round, right? But that's how we produce wastewater. We don't need nutrients all the time like this. And also that what happened is that cities expanded and grew. And as cities grew, like it wasn't possible to take water from cities and deliver it to agricultural areas anymore. So if you look at this, this is a photo from Los Angeles. So this is a wastewater treatment plant in Los Angeles. From this treatment plant, discharges about 800 million gallons a day of wastewater into the ocean. This is pretty standard. A lot of cities that are close to 1 billion gallons a day, like Chicago and Detroit. Also, you can see that there's no agriculture around the wastewater treatment plant. So what happened is basically to save energy, we put wastewater treatment plants at the low point in the topography so that we could drain water by gravity. And that happened to be in places that are convenient to discharge to, which is mostly surface waters, and just like here in Los Angeles. And at that point, sprawl happened. Basically, houses spread out around the area and encroach on the wastewater treatment plant. And there's no longer possible in almost any area to use the water from a wastewater treatment plant for irrigation. Like that's not really feasible unless you pump it a long way, and pumping turns out to be expensive when you're pumping it uphill and putting in new pipelines. So land treatment doesn't really happen too much anymore. We've spent a lot of time and money and resources putting in the wastewater collection system. It was mostly put in around the turn of the century. So this is a picture from, I think, 1905. You can see sewers going in, and they were hand dug. And then what happened is that we built cities on top of them, right? We put roads and buildings on top of these sewers. And we didn't maybe think about the long-term consequences that eventually these systems were going to corrode, and that's what's happening now, that the underground infrastructure is corroding and needs to be replaced, and it's pretty expensive to manage that. And so what we get is groundwater and surface water running into the wastewater treatment plant through the sewers that all leak. The idea that we could how we're going to modify or change this kind of infrastructure system is hard to imagine because we have so much invested already. But another thing that we didn't anticipate is that sea level rise was going to happen, and we get larger storms now than we had planned for when we were designing wastewater treatment plants in the 40s and 50s. We didn't anticipate the types of hurricanes that we're getting now. So this is the wastewater treatment plant, or one of the wastewater treatment plants for New Orleans. This was after Katrina. It basically it flooded, and this happens on a pretty regular basis now. It just happened in Hawaii. They had a hurricane last week, and I think you can see kind of some of the problems with this kind of a system. And all of our wastewater treatment plants, not all of them, but a lot of them are located in coastal areas, and that's where all the drainage goes to. So at some point, we may need to rethink how we located wastewater treatment plants and come up with a new model. Just to give you some perspective on the 2 wastewater treatment plants for New Orleans, the combined flow is 132 million gallons a day, so it's quite a bit of water. If you estimate how much nutrient content, the mass nutrients in that water, it would be about 28 tons of nitrogen and 4 tons of phosphorus per day. So it's not a trivial amount of nutrient. Basically, it's all the nutrients that we eat and we excrete ends up going through the wastewater treatment plant and getting dumped into rivers. I wanted to talk briefly about the different models for wastewater treatment plants that we have. This is a model that represents about half of the wastewater treatment capacity in the U.S. So about half of us use wastewater treatment plants that look a lot like this. So we could just call this conventional wastewater treatment based on a process called activated sludge. That just means that we use bacteria to treat the water. Very little nutrient removal happens in this type of a wastewater treatment plant, and so you can see that I say like a little bit of nitrogen goes off into the atmosphere, which is okay, right, because that's the global sink of nitrogen. A lot of nitrogen and phosphorus go out in the effluent into rivers and lakes. They go out because this type of treatment plant is not designed to remove the nutrients. This was designed to keep fish from dying mostly. So we take the carbon out and leave the nutrients in. A photo of a wastewater treatment plant. If you get, every city has one of these, right? So they kind of start to look all kind of the same. They all have the same components: primary clarification, an aeration basin, and then clarifiers. Kind of a more modern, and I guess we'd call this the state-of-the-art in wastewater treatment, is wastewater treatment with nutrient removal. So this was developed, processed in the 70s, around the same time that we got the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act was designed to protect surface waters. And so it's a kind of a process that removes nutrients from the water. And so this was a big step forward. It protected and saved a lot of lakes, at least in this country. A lot of countries don't even have wastewater treatment at all. But here we have some treatment plants that can remove nutrients. So this type in particular can remove nitrogen and phosphorus, so that we're discharging relatively clean water into lakes and rivers, and this is how we prevent algal blooms from occurring. Most of the nitrogen goes off into the atmosphere, so there's an easy way to get rid of it. And most of the phosphorus would end up either land applied or go to a landfill. A recent development is a process that can remove some of the phosphorus from the sludge that's going. So we're able to starting to recover some of the phosphorus. And as Craig showed earlier, the struvite from urine photo is on the right. But struvite by Astera is a company that that has a process that removes phosphorus from the sludge of a wastewater treatment plant. And they make these pellets. The photo in the middle is struvite from pipe. So struvite, I guess I should say what struvite is. So struvite is a mineral that forms when phosphate precipitates with magnesium and ammonium. And so it's a way that basically it used to be a problem in wastewater treatment plants because it grows in the pipes and makes the pipes constrict and plug up. Then you have to cut all the pipes out and replace them. But it also, we found a way to form it in a reactor so it doesn't plug up the pipes. And then we can also harvest it as a fertilizer. There's about a dozen other companies that make pellets similar to this one. So, and then the last slide that I have to share with you is kind of the future of wastewater treatment. So this is the research that we're doing now at universities and through private foundations, basically developing wastewater treatment plants that can recover all the energy and all the nutrients from wastewater and use those as resources and produce drinking water that's either safe for aquatic systems or safe for drinking. And so basically this is the wastewater treatment plant of the future, but we're not there yet. It's probably like, a decade away. So with that, so I've looked at the centralized kind of models of wastewater treatment, big municipal systems, and Pat's going to talk about the small-scale decentralized alternatives.
Thanks. So we understand that we have a problem with nutrient being in the wrong places, and you're all experts now on sort of conventional and state-of-the-art facilities to treat it all, and you're probably asking yourself, okay, how can we solve this? So I'm going to show a few sample projects that are attempting to close that gap. And we're going to start at the very small scale and work our way up. And so this first one is really a pilot project that they started in 2006. It was CREPA is 7 different countries in Western and Central Africa that are French-speaking. So what they started to do is they looked at small communities. They are taking all the feces, food waste, composting it, and applying that directly to the land as compost and soil building material. They're taking standard jerry cans. You can see that they're yellow in the beginning. That's when you fill them up. And they collect them. They take them to a central holding tanks. They let them sit for 4 to 6 months, at which time the pH rises. They start to sterilize themselves. They start getting into a usable state. And then they directly land apply them to the soil, avoiding hitting any of the foliage to burn it with the urine itself. And so they're able to basically close this little loop just in their little communities themselves. The success of this in all of these 7 nations measured by a few things. One, production of food crops were something in the range of like 190% increase in production. And in some areas, they could grow food that they could normally never grow there before just by applying this urine to the fields themselves. A second one is that 2 countries actually failed to complete the whole survey because the jerry cans were being stolen, emptied, and returned empty to the site. So they considered that a success, but they couldn't really measure how well they were doing. And then the third one, they actually did some things quantitative-wise. They were finding out in blind tests which food tastes better, food that was grown with urine or bulk fertilizer. So in this chart, you can see urea was the bulk fertilizer, and in some cases it had aftertaste. It was thick or as sour versus the urine, which had a lot of sweet and spicy taste to it, and just overall was more appealing.
We should say that it wasn't the urine that was sweet and spicy.
Yes.
It was the vegetables grown with.
Details. This next one is a fairly well-known project. It's in Sweden. They took a building, they recycled the building, and it's a collective housing. There's 38 units, there's 80 residents, and what they did is they went in and they replaced toilets with a urine diversion dry composting toilet. So all your solid waste would go straight into one compartment, and urine is collected in another one. So you can see it up on the screen that when men and women are sitting down, they have the same trajectory with their urine in order to collect that. And so what they would do is in the basement then, down below this, we have composting toilet. All of the solid waste goes in with the food waste, and that gets composted in both the basement and then out in sort of conventional areas. The urine is stored in big tanks. Again, they let that sit. Then they direct apply it to the fields in the same method that they were using in Africa, although they are mechanized. And then you can see the differences just in color, let alone height, of the different fields, one with bulk fertilizer, the other one with the recycled urine liquid. And then the last one, so that was sort of more, we had rural, we had suburban, now we have more urban example, which is in Germany. And this is a office commercial building. It's the headquarters of the German Agricultural Institute. And they have 400 full-time employees. They have 50 urine diverting dry toilets, again, and 23 waterless urinals. So they are collecting all of that. It all goes down to the basement. They're reusing gray water and treating it. They are collecting urine in the basement. Then they also have a struvite manufacturing system in there. So they're creating some raw fertilizer for being able to fertilize at different times of the year instead of just as you're getting it. And then they have black water treatment for all the other solids. They take all of that and in the nearby ag outside the city, they are applying it for the fields and actually growing food. And they're doing different. They're doing direct, both liquid and struvite fertilization. They're testing all sorts of things. And they actually fund quite a bit of this sort of work worldwide. So it's definitely a mission statement for them. And then we just wanted to leap forward into the U.S. a little bit to see what we're doing here and where our trajectory is. And so this is a project that our team worked on here, which is in Portland, Oregon. It's on Hazel and Ace. It was presented earlier today, and it's got a water reuse system. And it's taking rainwater and gray water, and we're treating black water as well. And it is going through a tidal wetland system. It is processing all of those waters. It's definitely doing its job as far as reducing the impacts on water in the urban area. But it is not yet, we're not yet able to recycle the nutrients out of that. We're recharging waters, we're treating waters, but we're yet to close really the gap on what we're missing out of this whole process. And then the last one is a project that was a competition that I won. This is called the NPK house. It's a greenhouse that meets Living Building Challenge, but more importantly, how it did it is really looking at the nutrient cycle. So it's taking all of the available nutrients that are produced in this building, right? So you have biomass that you use to create all the things growing there, and you're composting that. You're also composting in, again, a urine-diverting dry toilet, and you're using all of that to make the greenhouse function. The urine gets applied as fertilizer. The heat super composts all the green waste matter, all the solid matter, and that all gets applied back into the building for soil building and growing plants and heating the building. And then this project actually works better as you start running the numbers, is if you can start importing. So you import more and more compost or biomass from outside the footprint of the building, and you start including things like a public urinal that basically helps feed and fertilize all the plants. And so this is sort of a model that we use to do that. So you've got some data, you've got some history, you've got a few project examples, and now we're going to go over some questions.
Let's reflect.
Yeah.
Everyone breathe.
Everyone breathe. So some great questions from the cloud, and I'm just going to throw them at our panelists, and we'll get some answers. Do any of you know if Rick Fedrizzi has a urine diverting toilet?
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
We will. We'll do our best to confirm that and get back to you. Harold, any idea why all the phosphorus is in Morocco? And it's geological.
Geologic, I don't know.
Any geologists in the audience?
That particular asteroid landed there.
That's right. Phosphorus does not come from space, Pete. Harold, a few clarifying questions about wastewater treatment plants. Somebody asked about the costs of a very advanced nutrient recovery plant. So you could talk a little bit about that. And then a really good question, I have no idea, are wastewater treatment plants or ag runoff the greater problem in water pollution, surface water pollution?
So the first one, thinking about wastewater treatment plants that remove nutrients are more sophisticated, and they use a lot more. They use more energy because of that. But so there's more costs, obviously, to the capital costs to build them because of the additional processes. They're bigger. But if you look at the amount of energy that goes into wastewater treatment plants in general, it's about 2 kilowatt hours to treat 1,000 gallons of water, to give you some idea. So in the grand scheme of things, per person, that's about 0.2 kilowatt hours per person per day for wastewater treatment, which is pretty phenomenal. So to do nutrient removal requires slightly more energy than that, maybe 2.5 or 3 kilowatt hours per 1,000 gallons. So it's a slightly increase in the kind of incremental increase in energy to do nutrient removal. And the other question?
Wastewater treatments or ag?
So that depends, right? So if you're like in the Central Valley of California, so I'll just hit another question that I saw. The issue there is that from all the fertilizer that's been applied, the nitrogen runs through the soil and collects in the groundwater. So most of the groundwater in California is contaminated with nitrate from agriculture. There is like localized contamination around cities where the sewers are leaking and you have septic tanks. So around cities, under cities, the pollution is largely from urban areas. A lot of groundwater is contaminated by agriculture in agricultural regions. In like New Orleans, like we looked at the Gulf of Mexico, that's mostly agricultural runoff. So that's the mismanagement of fertilizer when it's applied to land, like over-application. But the contribution from wastewater treatment plants is not trivial either. So they're both significant and in different areas.
And certainly when you look internationally at huge mega cities, the wastewater fraction of nutrient load going in is enormous.
A couple questions about health. First, were there health concerns with sewage farms? And Pat talked a little bit about sterilizing the urine in the systems in Africa. But are there health concerns generally in sort of using this stuff on gardens?
Yeah, so I mean, the same health concerns that we had in Africa is the same ones we have in Mexico and in Guatemala and India. Wherever we have raw sewage that's being applied to land and there's farm workers there. So the farm workers are the people who are most exposed. So they're out there a lot of times barefoot, working in the fields, and there's a lot of parasites that come through in sewage, you could imagine. So a lot of like protozoan pathogens and viruses come through and survive and in soil, survive for a long time. And so there are pretty serious concerns to sewage farms. But we don't have those anymore in this country, but we still have those all over the world, just not here. And now, I mean, so one simple solution would be to wear boots, right? It would be a big step forward.
Start there, at least. Yeah.
That's pretty low tech. The food, is it
Yeah,
safe?
so if you ever, like, I guess when I go to Mexico or to India and I eat the food there, I often get sick if it's not cooked. So I think that there's, the food is can get contaminated as well, especially food that's eaten raw. So if you think of cilantro, and it's basically the stuff that's eaten raw is the greatest threat, because it is, there could be splashing, but also the workers who are picking it probably are not washing their hands. So the food's often not safe, but if you cook it, then it's pretty safe. That's why a lot of food is
Maybe,
cooked
Harold,
there.
you can make the distinction of fertilizing with urine, stabilized urine, versus fertilizing with like raw sewage, and how that.
Mention what Pete and Pat, did you want to take this one on? So if you take urine and you store it, so what happens is that urine gets contaminated with feces during source. When the source separating toilet is pretty effective, but it's not 100%. So there's often fecal contamination of urine in the source separating toilets. And so if you store that material for 6 months or 9 months, most all of the viruses that we're worried about die off in that time period, because when you store urine, the pH goes up really high to over 9, could be 9.3. And so this high pH and the high salinity makes things die off fast. So urine is relatively safe to apply, and that's the rationale behind the storage period that Pat was talking about.
So we had a couple questions about phosphorus. Are there alternatives to the use of phosphorus? As far as I know, none at all. It's alternative sources, correct? And one of those is just recovering it after it goes through the cycle. Somebody asked, what happened to all the guano? So on that graph I showed of global phosphorus use over time, there's a blip of guano use. That comes from South Sea Islands. So this was in the time before rock phosphate was industrialized, and they found the process and scaled up the process to make really strong fertilizer out of it. Guano, and particularly kind of dried guano over millennia on South Sea Islands was a source for the Western world. And so with slave labor, I'm sure, they went to these South Sea Islands and basically strip mined them. And in 50 years, the resource was gone. And so, you know, there's historical precedent for nutrient descent, shall we say. Pat, in the jerry can fertilization scheme, no, does that mean they eliminate chemical fertilizer?
What's that? Is it
Is
it eliminating it?
Yeah. So when they're using the urine, are they not using any chemical fertilizer? Can they
Total replacement.
completely
Is it
eliminate
a total replacement? I don't know that for sure, but all the literature is pointing to these are communities that don't have a lot of economic growth at all, and so they're looking at what people would normally spend per year to fertilize the fields that are basically feeding their own family was about $6 a year in fertilizer. And they figured that the fertilizer that they were collecting, they could, as a one-to-one relationship, the urine that they were excreting for a whole year would replace that entirely. So basically, their urine is worth $6 a year. Conversely, if you grew corn on it, then all of that corn, whatever the value was that they would take to market, was basically all out of their own just hard work of collecting it and putting it on the field. So just simply monetarily, it would pencil out.
Right. Value added.
Value added.
Nice. Pete, I'm going to package a few of these questions for you. Somebody asked about how tidal wetlands work, and I know you know a little bit about that. And somebody else asked about the application of wetland treatment in larger scale systems. And then related to that is this question about whether it's better to recover nitrogen or release it to the air.
Okay, so I'm going to take the second question first, which is the percent of natural systems in kind of the scale of wastewater treatment globally. And Harold showed that first slide of about 50% of our conventional plants were just doing this really basic treatment. And his second schematic showed kind of the other 50%. So natural systems in terms of large municipal scale treatment globally is fairly minuscule. And that's because when you... Today. Yes, today. And so, and why that is because we take all of our water in our cities and we concentrate it in one point. Right? And there's a clear relationship between land requirement and energy requirement when you're doing treatment. And so when you have a ton of water, you either use a ton of energy to treat it or you use a ton of land area. And so natural systems having a larger land area are problematic near our urban centers. Just a quick answer on tidal wetlands. So tidal wetlands are mimicking wetlands near our coastlines where water comes in and fills up a wetland area and then comes out. And so that fill and drain process creates two unique ecosystems, one that's saturated and one that's unsaturated. And so there's bacteria that like that condition, and you get both a nitrification and denitrification process within one nice wetland cell. That's a simple answer. And the last...
Well, it was
release
also, nitrogen?
Oh, yeah.
Or?
So great question. Both are good, but what happens is when we put nitrogen back in the air, where 78% of our air is our nitrogen, it's benign, it's not hurting anything, but it's not helping anything. It's not useful. So what we need to do is we need to spend all this fossil fuel energy with the Haber-Bosch process that I described to pull it out of the air and to a usable form where we can have it in fertilizer and use it as fertilizer. So we can skip that whole step if we immediately make it usable and not have to burn fossil fuels to make it usable. So it's better to keep it as a usable solid than put it into the air.
There's a great question that just came up. What about endocrine disruptors? And that sort of brings up the question of if we're envisioning a closed loop system of nutrients and that loop involves humans, is there stuff that we're concentrating in there? Endocrine disruptors, pharmaceuticals. What about that? Either of you.
I'll just comment on that real quick.
Okay.
So it turns out that most of the things that we call endocrine disruptors actually get excreted with our urine. So a lot of the pharmaceutical residues basically just get excreted mostly through urine, and that if you take urine and you apply it on the soil, we can let the soil try to chew on that stuff and break it down. So that's advantageous. It doesn't end up in struvite. It's separated. But it does go through our wastewater treatment plants because they're not designed to remove these chemicals. So endocrine disruptors are chemicals that cause disruption of the endocrine system. Mostly, the most sensitive species are mostly aquatic species like fish and amphibians. And so we don't really want these things in the environment, but they move right through wastewater treatment plants and they end up in all of our water supply. So basically all of our water supply, like groundwater and surface water, is contaminated with these trace quantities of chemicals that we can't remove in wastewater treatment.
And then just to add on to that, and so if you apply water or urine or some liquid substance that has pharmaceuticals or estrogens or other compounds that are very complex, the unsaturated soil is one of the best treatment mechanisms for breaking those really complex carbon molecules, right? What happens when we discharge it to a river or stream, like all of our wastewater plants, in that saturated aqueous solution, it's not treated. So it's really important that we can capture that and get it onto the land where it has a potential for being treated, because in our waterways it's not.
And then the last one that I think we haven't covered is somebody asked, so no cremation. No cremation. As in waste management, if there's incineration, there's no recycling. So cremation is out. If anyone else has a burning question that you'd like to ask verbally, there are 2 microphones here. And if not, we'll jump on to the next.
And I'll say that we're going to be getting all of these questions after the session, and Harold will answer them all in an email and send it all to. No, we'll figure out a way of continuing this dialogue. But please, thank you for those questions. It's great.
They're fantastic. Actually, another one just popped up, and I'm not sure I understand this one.
Biochar is one model.
So biochar is basically a way we can convert organic waste that's in wastewater. If you separate that waste, you can put it through a gasification or a pyrolysis process, collect the gas off of it and use that gas as energy. And then the carbon that's left is basically called char, almost like a charcoal. That's fixed carbon, and you can use that as an agricultural amendment. It's a soil amendment, and it's basically a way to take this kind of carbon that would normally be getting put back in the atmosphere and fixing it as a solid carbon as a form of a biochar. And so that was the concept. And actually we figured out that if there's enough energy coming into a wastewater treatment plant in the organic compounds and in the heat from all the hot water that we use, that's enough energy to actually run the wastewater treatment plant. And that's also another thing that's kind of on the horizon. There's actually a couple of treatment plants that have actually achieved that.
Okay.
So we look at the global scale, our planet, we have achieved net zero nutrients. Woohoo! Right? There's no new nitrogen or phosphorus coming into our planet, and certainly none leaving our planet. And so it's simple. But as we tunnel down to smaller scale, that's not quite the case. So if we start to tunnel down and we look at North America or the United States, we can see we're importing tons of nutrients. We're exporting tons of nutrients. We have nutrients out of place and getting in the Gulf of Mexico and causing havoc there and in all of our urban waterways. And as we tunnel further, looking at a small chunk of the French Quarter, we can start to identify what these kind of different community scale nutrients flows are. So, all right, we have certain sources like food as a source of nutrients. Beignets. And we use those nutrients within our communities, right? In restaurants, and then that nutrients gets transformed into waste. That waste either ends up in our landfills or ends up in our wastewater treatment plants. This is the one acronym you must learn from this talk is WWTP, which means wastewater treatment plant. Very important. There'll be a quiz later on that. And then ultimately that ends up in our coastal waters, right? And that's the same if we look at houses and homes, right? We're consuming food, we're excreting that. It's moving into our waterways. And then if we unpack a little bit the transformation in kind of our open spaces, right? We have denitrification, so where plants are moving nitrogen back into the air. Lightning is a way nitrogen can fixed into the soil. Legumes, those types of plants are fixing nitrogen into the soil. We have fertilizers and compost, which are ways, solid ways that we're moving nitrogen around our communities. It can run off into our coastal waters. It can get collected as green waste, which can be either sent to a landfill or can be recycled as a usable product back into compost and fertilizers. So, as we tunnel down, we're starting to see some of these connections and where our sources and sinks can get blurred, right? Food equals waste, waste equals food, and
vice versa.
And the other way around. And so this is the exercise that we would like you all to help us think about, and kind of zoomed into this small scale to understand tracking nutrients. And so we're really gonna go to the next slide here. We're going to crowdsource.
You are indeed. The idea behind the exercise, the crowdsourcing, is we have three parts of it. So first, we're going to ask you to participate in kind of a mapping exercise, and we're really interested in how you draw the maps that Pete just showed you. Maybe you have a different way that you're sort of envisioning this cycle. So we'll show your work. We're interested in how you put it down on the paper. Second, we're going to ask you we'll ask you to map in that first part, we'll ask you to map the status quo, right? And then in the second part, we'll ask you to take a look at one portion of your map and look for a wasted resource and try and think about how that could be recycled. And then in the third, we're going to ask you to help us figure out how to distill all that thinking down into a design goal that we can talk about in green building. We have another poll question that you can use to sort of throw things out to the group or to us as we work through. So part one.
So, jumping back out into space a little bit, I want to tell you about our project site. You can see on the left we have the greater New Orleans area, the Mississippi River that flows into the Gulf of Mexico. So we're going to zoom into the east side of New Orleans on the right. I'll explain some of those colored blotches in a moment. If you can see, there's a small red rectangle on the right side. This is the lower 9th Ward. I'm going to zoom in. This is one neighborhood in the lower 9th Ward. This is Holy Cross neighborhood. It's one of the 4 major neighborhoods. This is an area that was devastated with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. There was 10 feet of water over Holy Cross neighborhood. Right? Very wet. In the 2000 census, there was about 5,500 people living in this neighborhood. This is 1 square mile. 1 square mile, 5,500 people lived there. 10 feet of water came in, and the 2010 census, we have about 2,700 people living here now. A vastly different place. But over that time and through history, the Holy Cross campus, this 13-acre campus, which is that other small red rectangle, has always been the heart of the Holy Cross neighborhood. And the reason we highlighted this small campus in this neighborhood, and it was released a couple days ago, or at least presented a couple days ago, it's the first Living Community Challenge project. zoom in on that project site. This is 13 acres. Perez Architects, local architects, talked about this earlier on Tuesday in the week. Some of the existing infrastructure that's there. And as I said earlier, this is always a hub in the community since the late 1800s. This has always been a center of interaction. And now, since Hurricane Katrina, it's been vacant. And so they're thinking about what are the possibilities of revitalizing this area and using the Holy Cross campus as a hub for the Holy Cross neighborhood. So, the exercise. Everyone has paper on their tables and pens. And we encourage, if there's just one or two people at a table, feel free to jump over to another table to join this crowdsourcing exercise. And this is going to be a quick exercise. So 10 minutes. What we'd like you to do is take this map. You have a blank piece of paper, but we would like you to draw the sources and uses and sinks of nutrients within this community. And now to start that, you need to define a boundary. So you can use the 1 square mile of the Holy Cross neighborhood, or you can zoom in and use just the Holy Cross campus, which is that little 13-acre chunk, or pick any scale you want. But the point of the exercise is to map out current nutrient flows as of today. Where are the sources of those nutrients in this community? How are they used? And where are they going? What are the sinks?
Right. And we should say there are no right answers. We're interested in how you're thinking about it. We're interested in how you're thinking about how it might get depicted on the paper. We're looking for ideas we can steal. Let's put it right out there. For a graphical approach to talking about, to communicating nutrient flow. And so take your understanding of nutrient flow. Hopefully we've helped you with that a little bit today, and try to explore it in graphic form. I bet there's one person at every table who's good with a pen, so jump in.
The address for the site is 4900 Royal Street, so you could Google that on your phone, smartphone.
Yeah, feel free to...
And you can zoom in and out and see things.
Feel free to gather as much information as you can. Again, this is a quick 10-minute exercise, part 1, and part 2, we're going to be back in 10 minutes to launch into part 2. There was a question over here.
Just for clarification, the red rectangle isn't actually the project site shown up. It's at least what you showed earlier had it over to the left.
Oh, that's shifted
correct?
over. You're right. It's
okay. It's over.
The back one?
It doesn't...
over by the ball fields.
Yeah, it's in the wrong location. That's my mistake.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification, though. It's shifted over 2 blocks. Wow.
You want to go back to the Perez diagram?
Yeah. Let's do that. There it is. So, you have 10 minutes, and we're going to run around. Feel free to grab us, ask questions, and begin.
Think about the current state of affairs.
What are we doing, time? So it looks like there's some good discussion going on. Just wanted to throw a couple tidbits out there, see if you're including this in your community map. How many tables are looking at pet waste? Nice. Right? Nutrients and pet waste, lawn fertilizer, right? How many folks are thinking about the embodied nutrients within materials that we buy or sell or use? There's a bunch of blank stares there. So think about, when we talk about embodied energy in our green buildings, think about embodied nutrients. How much does it take to transport nutrients, grow a tree, all sorts of different things. So continue a couple more minutes, maybe 4 more minutes.
All right, so another, the
Wait.
next part of this exercise,
Part two.
part two, is to think about, now that you have, let's assume you have some kind of map drawn that's showing these kind of nutrient flows through either a community or through a region or through a city. Look at least take one of those nutrient flows and think how we could kind of intervene in the process and change it, like close the loop. How could we close one of the nutrient loops that you have drawn on your hypothetical site? So take a look at that. And the goal is really to see how we could close the loop.
Yeah,
And
so-
think about the kind of considerations, like what are some of the complicating factors that have to be taken into consideration in doing that.
So identify a waste, figure out what strategies you would use to close that loop within the boundaries that you've fixed on your community. Questions? Okay, a few minutes to do that. Again, we'll be walking around. If you have questions, ask us. Define a waste in your community map. Define a waste stream and figure out how to close that loop. What strategies would you use to close that? 5 minutes.
As you're closing up these loops, ask yourself the questions, what opportunities do these open up as you close these loops? Does it open up any opportunities? Or does it make more constraints? Did you have to scale jump in order to solve some of these problems of closing the loop?
A great question. The whole scale jumping, right? If you're at the smaller campus scale, but looking at strategies for that, did you really need to look farther out? So,
or conversely, did you have wider range and you needed to reduce transportation and water moving materials, and so you wanted them smaller in?
So we'll go for like 2-3 more minutes before part 3 of the crowdsourcing.
Okay, we're into the final phase here of our crowdsourcing exercise. So we've created the status quo. You guys have tried to close a resource loop. And at this point, if you could, our design goal is what we're going to try to introduce that concept to you. We're trying to distill the thinking down and try to think of this as think of your design thinking as being written up in an RFP. So in order to write this up in a way that you're going to try to achieve some sort of nutrient cycling through like RFP write-up and some sort of measurement of how to achieve that. So for instance, we could use a measurement such as net zero energy, right? So you measure what's going in and what's going out and seeing the delta on that in order to achieve net zero energy. Could you use something analogous to the net zero energy model to measure your nutrient flow? Okay, so that's one measurement that you can sort of look at in order to measure your nutrient flow. Another one may be from Living Building Challenge projects that look at materials, right, and how far away they are from the project site and what you're allowed to bring in. The heavier they are, the more embodied energy they are, the closer they need to be to the site. So you could use that as a metric or measurement to measure your solution to this one leg of the nutrient cycle that you're trying to reduce. Or it could be something that you come up with totally on your own. Some sort of measurement that you would write up in the RFP that would basically say, look, we're trying to achieve this sort of level in our nutrient recovery. That's the exercise.
What is the shorthand?
Yeah.
How do we describe what it is you've been working on? We don't know. We're curious
That's
to
why
find
you're
out.
here.
And do we have 15?
So we have how many minutes?
Maybe 8 minutes.
8 minutes to think about that. And again, ask questions, insights, struggles with trying to figure out the metric for understanding nutrients within our communities. I know this last part was a little bit of a struggle, trying to understand if we value how nutrients are moving through our community, how do we quantify that, right? If I have a client that wants to build a new neighborhood and they want that neighborhood to be net zero energy, that's easy for all of us to kind of quantify. If they want to be net zero water, kind of understand what that framework looks like. But if we want to be smart nutrient managers, how do we measure success, right? So I think we kind of observed everyone struggling with that. And so we want to talk about that a little bit.
Does anybody have an insight or a question they'd like to share? Harold and Pat are going to walk around.
Yeah, we have mobile mics, so raise your hand and they'll run around. This is the report back, the feedback from you're about to be crowdsourced, or have you ever been sourced crowdly? This is what's happening.
Gunther.
We were just wondering if we were actually running into that age-old question of, is it about population control? And is there a carrying capacity for the land based on the number of people that can be on that land to make it a closed-loop system?
We have a Malthusian in the audience.
Yeah, that's interesting, looking at how much food you can grow on that site, how much nutrients you can manage on that site appropriately, and design your population based on that. That's certainly something. Pat,
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so we also talked about maybe a BMI, like, your basic metabolic indicator or something like that. So as a body, you have to have a certain number of calories every day in order to just keep your body alive. So could you take BMI as some sort of indicator for your site?
Interesting.
anyone else look at it that way? What else?
We had a question about scale that popped up on the screen, and I think the question of carrying capacity relates directly to scale. And so I'm curious if anybody, as you were trying to close that loop in the second piece, did anybody have to go to a bigger scale? Like that started considering a sort of a small site and then had to think about, do you want to tell us about that?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how to put this, but we were definitely thinking about the difference between a closed system and an open system. And, if the site needed to provide everything for itself, that might not actually be like what a piece of land by a riverside would be expected to do. So I was thinking about, when we were talking about and that's what we're struggling with, I guess, is, to the degree to which we could make the values of the nutrients on this particular site or the functions of the site, make that value tradable with its neighbors, ecosystem services, that kind of thing.
Just adding something that sort of came to my mind, I hadn't talked to the group. When you think about net zero energy, you're always thinking about, you're looking at time scale as well, because sometimes the energy is flowing one way, sometimes it's flowing the other way, and you're looking for a balance. And I don't think we really thought about, well, are the sinks and sources changing over the course of time, over the course of the year? And then how do you think about that in the equation?
That's great. And the reason you're all here is because we've been struggling with these same issues, right? And I think even last night we were talking about this time scale thing. Is it's really convenient for us to measure things annually. Annual water use, annual energy use. And we're like, well, maybe nutrients is like a decade, right? Like, are we net zero or net positive in a decade? So that's an interesting question. Certainly we struggled with that.
Yeah, so if you think about sustainable agricultural practices and rotational crop cycling, right? They usually have like a 5-year agribusiness plan where they're rotating those crops every 5 years. So maybe a 5-year or a 10-year time frame is more appropriate.
Right down front here.
Hi. So we tried to quantify some of our goals by setting percentages, and this is what we came up with: was capture and treat 100% of surface runoff, and divert 80% of waste to composting and recycling away from the landfill, eliminate non-compostable and non-recyclable containers, like through a taxation like they have on plastic bags, and also produce at least 10% of food within the community through a community garden. So we tried to put some numbers and goals to our closed loop.
Great. Anyone else look at food production as a metric? How much food you could produce within that? See a couple of nods. Yeah. Folks back there.
Maybe right there, Harold.
I think we tried to isolate just the food component, but then realized that to really make that whole area like how we would want it to be, you would almost have to tighten it up even more. So those people shouldn't even shop outside of that community. They should buy all their food, in the community, their grocery store in the community. All their solid waste will be collected and associated with the composting facility. Like she mentioned, zero runoff. It would be no runoff because you are on the water, so that would be kind of wrong to be allowing your nutrients to run off into water. Composting, so farms would produce enough food to actually be kept in the grocery store, so you have to use traditional practices, outdoor hoop houses. So when you really think about okay, here's a developer that wants to do a net zero community, he almost has to consider what are all those needs for those people in that community, so that in the end they might export their net positive energy to other communities. So they might have fertilizer to give to outside farmers, but for the most part, they're net zero inside with that positive extra. Kind of like if you produce too much electricity, they give you a credit, so to speak.
So. Net positive nutrients. That's
Yeah. You bring up an interesting question about having access to food, right? So it's a huge social justice issue. One thing we didn't talk about this neighborhood, and there's tons of information, and I think Prez Architects is one of the organizations is helping to collect kind of this wisdom around the potential within this area, but there's no grocery stores currently anywhere in the Holy Cross neighborhood. People don't really have access to food. I think there's a couple corner stores, but that's not as helpful if you're raising a family.
Right.
Whoa, this is really loud. Sorry, guys. We took a little more of a fun route with this.
Good.
And I think that when you're talking about social justice, I think that there's an opportunity for the nutrients to create a higher sense of community and gathering by what they produce. So with that in mind, we did some calculations, and we decided that it would be really great if this site could produce enough pumpkins to make pumpkin pies for the whole community for Thanksgiving.
Pumpkin pie metrics. I love it.
We found that knowing that one person can fertilize a 50 by 50 site, as you told us earlier, and you need approximately 80 square feet to grow one pumpkin, we found that one person can make 31 pumpkins in a year, or 31 pumpkin pies, depending upon the size of the pumpkin. So that was our metric.
Did anyone else come up with a pumpkin pie metric?
It sounds like a net positive pumpkin pie equation to me, and that's impressive.
That's great.
Just thinking about it some more, if we think about net zero nutrients and wherever we draw our boundary, it seems like you can't divorce that from the implications it may have on water and energy at the same time, because I've heard about how we get our, have energy-intensive processes to extract some nutrients, that sort of thing. So it seems like you can't separate them exactly.
So we had a question about linking fuel cells to biogas, part of the sort of waste processing process. And there are intimate connections, right, between, as you say, between water and energy and nutrients and waste in general. One of the things that we've noticed when people talk about, say, tidal wetlands, on-site wastewater processing, and we always look at that as a water efficiency measure, essentially, and so the question with nutrients is can we look further and find sort of greater synergies that help justify those systems?
Sorry, just loud. One point that as we were sort of talking through this, we were kind of talking around it, but is worth pointing out in the net zero conversation. When you have a high rise, you sort of realize you can't do net zero energy with a high rise because it's too much density per collection area that's available. And when you sort of think about the use of the site and the ability to sort of grow a certain amount of food you want, you still want to preserve density, I assume, as a goal. And that just makes, sort of obviates the need for some other resource that exists, essentially land area, ideally nearby, right? So the idea of, I like the idea of some percentage of food grown on site because of the sort of implications of that. But we were talking about essentially looking at all the major waste or nutrient streams leaving the site or waste streams leaving the site. And I think the two biggest ones are likely solid waste and sewage, and essentially saying, as a metric, 100% of that need to be converted into a usable nutrient product for something within a, and then you sort of fix a few different radii, obviously, ideally within 10 miles or 100 miles or something like that, so that, presumably there's some sort of field that can exist nearby or some sort of compost facility that can exist nearby. And so maybe just sort of realizing that not everything has to happen right on the site, but that the nature of a dense site requires additional kind of land resources. And then part of the equation, the equation is figuring out how to build those into it or use those as part of the metric.
And I think when you look at those two, wastewater flows and solid waste flows, right? The infrastructure to deal with those don't necessarily optimize at the same scale. So when we think about that, it's like, well, maybe there are different overlays, different districts that you have a wastewater overlay that is a 6-block area, but a solid waste overlay that's a 20-block area, right? So there's a kind of further complication within that.
So perhaps another way to think about it as well is just to use an ecological model. Let's say within the watershed, right? So define a watershed or an environmental subsection. So we have a loop that's within that watershed. So we're closing the loop just within that region then.
Anyone think at a watershed kind of boundary? You drew your boundary?
So one perspective that we had, which I think is kind of bouncing off of these other ones that we've heard, is that we don't think that net zero nutrients is a reasonable metric for a building because it doesn't really make sense with how people use the building. Building itself, we said, was innocent and really not guilty of being involved in this, but it's all the people that are passing through from all over the place. So what we thought was that maybe we wanted to do something that had a value-added proposition, kind of like the pumpkin pie, idea, and that was restorative or regenerative in terms of actually being able to share a resource back out and that kind of do no harm type of thing. So I like the pumpkin pies. I think that's exactly where it should be going.
We had an idea. We had an idea sort of similarly in that if we created a composting area and invited our neighbors to bring their compost, and then we would use our compost for farming, and they would bring their nutrients. We would compost it. We would grow food. They would grow food with the compost, and then we would have a community farmers market, and we could even organize so we knew what everybody was growing, so we could kind of, on a community-wide basis, share our nutrients and share our food.
Anyway. That makes me wonder if there's a CSA model there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps that the metric is social equity or in some sort of community involvement, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a physical thing, maybe it's a transformative thing that's more society-based, community-based, livability-based.
Measured on how happy someone is.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we were kind of struggling with was this idea of scale. But one of the things that was so unique about this piece of property was the canals right next to it. So if you think about that idea of watershed, the idea of nutrients, the arterial, the waterway arterial right there, seems like that's a very unique way within this particular piece of property to draw nutrients and create a net positive aspect. Now, I was looking at it from an energy generation point of view, but from a nutrient intake point of view, I'm just kind of curious how other people feel about that. Just you are drawing from something that is created elsewhere into this particular site, but if you can create that generation as a net positive aspect, can you use that as the beginning of a demonstration model that unduly takes advantage of that particular piece of property, but creates a net positive that allows you to fund the business model to continue to expand the effect of this particular piece of property and ideally have it continue to card into other projects. Does that make sense?
So to clarify, are you proposing extracting nutrients from the polluted water adjacent?
Extract whatever available nutrients you could from the polluted water adjacent.
That's
yes.
Right. Certainly the surface water is a problem for the whole greater New Orleans area, but if you're able to help solve some of that problem in a small, unique way and convert that to something usable and positive for a smaller chunk of the community, that's a great idea. Anyone else think of that?
We didn't talk about this at the table, but I was thinking about the example that you showed of the cans that people could use. What if you paid people for their urine in the neighborhood and did that at a sort of a bigger scale and then actually made that available?
Pay to pee.
Harold, do you want to address that?
You're going to become a shill.
Well, who's going to? I guess who's going to pay for it is the question. Maybe. I guess it also brings up the idea of if you had a farm and nutrients were coming to a farm, could you specify that a certain percent of the nutrients, or that the food is grown with sustainable nutrients that were harvested from wastewater, from rivers, or from wherever, and those are going to be used in the process instead of mined or extracted nutrients. So maybe you could certify farms to say this farm uses 10% sustainable nutrients.
Yeah, we often talk about there's a limit from what we can buy from, right? We have to try to source things within 50 miles or whatever. I heard someone earlier talk about, well, what if we limit where you can sell? You can only sell within 50 miles of where you're growing something. Right? It kind of turns it around. I don't know that we want to start putting more restrictions on farming, but it's an interesting idea. And what it does is start to create a relationship between both grower and user and say, well, what does this community need? It doesn't need this one monocrop that I want to grow. Right. And I think that dialogue is useful, whether that's the appropriate metric or not, arguable. Someone over here?
Yes. Well, one of the metrics is mainly the food, right? So that's the main input of NPK is what people are consuming in their bodies and putting back out. And even if you compost everything, you can't really control, or you don't know what the value is of what people are, they're still going to eat their McDonald's. I work with an urban farm in Houston now, and we're in a neighborhood very similar to this, food desert. And we have people bring their food waste, and we do have a small-scale composting operation going now. We're taking food from Whole Foods that they were trucking all the way back to Austin, and we've intercepted that. And that is now going to be beets in about 6 weeks. But I was thinking maybe the measurement would be in this actual soil. If you're doing regenerative farming, if somehow you could measure the composition of the soil to show that your community is now building capacity to support itself, should holy hell break loose and gas is $300 a gallon and we can't truck our food in from somewhere else anymore. You know,
Soil
so
fertility as a metric.
Yeah,
I think
soil
that's,
fertility.
that's
Soil
really,
will save us. Is the
really
next
profound.
phase.
Great.
Harold, is there an objective measure for soil fertility?
I mean, you can measure soil fertility.
Or you could just do it. You could just almost do it in a delta. You know, think about the Living Building Challenge. You don't want to develop a site that hasn't already been developed, right? So you're trying to turn brownfields into green fields, essentially, right? So maybe the metric is, okay, this is the baseline for soil or agri health, right? And so if you increase that by 10%, 20%, 30%, whatever it is, and you start showing that you are actually regeneratively fixing what we've basically destroyed. So maybe that's the metric in itself, is how well you're building soil, how well you're planning for the future. Maybe that's a metric. I kind of like the idea of combining that with physical health. Would we have a metric that basically just measures our own health and the health of the soil that we're standing on? Kind of interesting.
The one thing we wanted to do before we ended, and we have about 10 minutes left in the session, is ask this question. We've asked this one other time when we gave a similar talk trying to understand these ideas is, you know, what will you do with this information? What's exciting about this topic? And how will you use this over the next 12 months? And is this worth talking about next year at Greenbuild? If so, what is that? So we offered tweet responses over the next 10 minutes, and feel free to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. And Pat and Harold, maybe come up and we'll do some sort of closing thoughts.
Yeah. The mics will be out, still out there. What's exciting about this topic? Or is this interesting? Or this is too complex to even tackle, and we should get back to sustainable building materials or something? Good list.
Perhaps it goes without saying that we would love to test it conceptually on a project, and so, or in reality on a project.
I mean, lots of you out there have projects. How many feel comfortable going to their clients and saying, we should think about nutrients? Water, energy, been there, done that. Let's think about a new way to manage nutrients on site. That's super sexy. Oh yeah, there we go. All right, there's a couple folks.
There you go.
Thoughts?
Any closing thoughts from the panel?
There's been some metrics that I didn't think of it before at all, and I think are really intriguing, which is some of the social connections, rebuilding community just socially, thinking about our own health, our own body health. We know what's going on, at least in the U.S. I mean, we're not as healthy as we could be, and our landscape isn't as healthy as it once was. So maybe the metric is just fixing what is sick right now in the model, and just using it as an increase in health for those things. I think that's pretty intriguing.
There's a comment that just came up about net zero resources. Why are we treating these things in silos? Why do we have the water silo, the energy silo, the nutrient silo? Just net zero resources. Kind of reframing that. I like that.
I do too. Harold, anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is when we were talking about the soil fertility. So one area where we have a problem is that we overapply nutrients to the soil. We overapply fertilizer. That ends up polluting our groundwater or running off. So it's not just about the soil itself, but also about nutrient management on farms is kind of a critical topic. And that's one thing, that we haven't totally figured out. But in California, actually, the state's starting to regulate and do nutrient balances on farms to say that you can't apply more nutrients onto a crop than you haul away in the crop. So I think it's starting to happen even on the state level. because of the widespread pollution that nutrient runoff causes.
Somebody just texted, talk to large-scale urban composters about revenue potential. I think revenue potential is the key piece there. These nutrients have value. It's small, but the volume of nutrients that Harold was talking about coursing through the sewers of New Orleans can potentially have, that can add up to real dollars. Removing nutrients in advance of them getting in a place where we don't want has some value potentially, or offsetting systems that come down. I think there's lots of thinking to do about how you sort of monetize this process. That's how we get things done in the green building teams. So think about the dollars.
Well, and peak phosphorus is, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but it's imminent, right? I mean, most of our phosphorus is in Morocco. The U.S. has secured a huge percentage of that resource. It's not a coincidence that we have military presence there. It's a huge, valuable resource, and it's going to become more and more valuable as that resource.
That's true. Yeah. Okay, I think unless there's anything else from anyone, I think we'll bring this to a close. Thank you all for coming. As a source, you're a great crowd.
And participating.
There was some really interesting work going on, and we'll collect the papers and we'll do our best to capture this in some notes. As a group, we'd like to create a white paper on this process, and so look for that coming from us soon, we hope. A few thank yous. Mike, Tyson, and Scott are at the back of the room, the tech guys who did a great job, so thank you guys for that. And a personal thank you on my part. I want to thank GlueMac engineers for sponsoring my trip to Greenbuild. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. And if you are interested in continuing this dialogue, we're trying to figure out creative ways of gathering that collective wisdom. So feel free to drop your card if you're interested in helping to continue that dialogue. So thanks again.